You're listening to One Free Family, a new take on peaceful parenting, where you can hear ideas for helping to raise free, independent, and peaceful children. Visit onefreefamily.com to connect and listen. Here are your hosts, James and Taylor Davis.
And we're back with another episode of One Free Family. This is James.
And Taylor.
And it's been a while since you and I had been in the same room together. We released a couple of episodes.
Well, I mean, we've been in the same room together quite often.
Fair. Well, I'm talking about...
You mean here in the studio?
Yeah, for the people, the thing the listeners care about, which is for us recording the podcast. I'm sure they would love to hear about all the things we've been doing in rooms together, cooking the food, feeding the bearded dragon, etc. And for their purposes, I'm sure they're mostly excited about when we get in the same room together to record the podcast.
Sure. And by the way, the studio is your parents' attic. It's just made us sound a lot fancier than we really are.
Also, there's not just like insulation falling on our heads.
Oh, it's finished. It's nice. Sure.
It's a lovely attic here in New Hampshire. And hopefully you got to hear our episodes with Sylvia Van Meerten and Kelly Halderson.
Those were really fun.
They were really fun. And I think they came out great. But sometimes people want the A-team. They want you and me talking shop.
Jamming. We got it. Here we are.
Spitting knowledge. Dropping science.
Okay.
Yeah. That is code for let's move on. So we'll do that real quick. I wanted to thank all of our lovely patrons and supporters out in the Facebook group, people that really keep the community going, even when you and I aren't recording together. There's still lots of great episodes or little mini conversations and episodes happening in the Facebook group all the time.
Yeah, we are still continue to be very grateful for that space. If you listen to the last episode that we released, that was just the two of us. You heard about just some shifts that are going on in our life and some restructuring of work responsibilities and schedules. And we're still in the midst of figuring that all out. But that's a little bit of the reason that we've been a little more absent from the Facebook group space and from recording, but we are excited to jump back in today.
Yeah, and the good news is, now that ski season is over, our Mondays are free again. We've been doing really fun skiing with our kids every Mondays, but now that these days are open, we will be recording every Monday.
We have a little more of a regular thing we can rely on,
for the foreseeable future. I've also been going to bed earlier, so that's made it hard to do nighttime recordings.
Oh, remember that episode we did, forever ago? That was the first moments of the day.
Yeah.
We should make a new one because you're a whole new person now.
Well, I've got to say I've cleaned up my act a little bit here in the last month. I hate to brag, so I'm not going to do it on this episode, but maybe we can do that in the future. But yeah, I guess a long story short is I've been trying to change a few habits, and I think it's been going pretty well.
I think so too. I like to hear you kind of puttering around in the house before I'm even awake. Yeah, it's what's he doing? What could he possibly be doing?
Literally
Who knows?
First time in 15 years that I've been waking up before you.
I know. It's crazy.
So here we are. And this will be a perfect segue into our topic because sometimes it seems like things will never change. And in my life, that was going to bed early. I have not gone to bed early on purpose for my entire life. And now here I am at age 37, going to bed when it gets dark out. Or once our kids are finally asleep, mostly. But that has nothing to do with what the actual subject is.
Let's go ahead and jump in.
Why don't we jump in? That's about this general feeling that I think basically every parent can relate to, which is, and especially when you're a new parent, but it turns out basically whenever you're experiencing a new moment in parenting or a new type of problem, I think so many people will go into this fear of, well, this problem is going to be a problem forever now. I'm when you're a new parent, it's, okay, I guess I can kiss the next 18 years of sleeping through the night goodbye, right? This baby is waking up every hour and crying. And you sit there and you talk to your friends or maybe your parents and try to figure out when you'll finally be out from under this blanket of no sleep. And it starts then. And like I said, it lasts right through the teenage years based on my experience in talking to people with teenage kids, which is that at any given moment in life, something is the biggest problem you're dealing with.
Exactly, right. At any moment, there's something that your kid is dealing with or you're dealing with that feels challenging or that maybe you find yourself wishing wasn't there or wasn't an issue. Right. And I would say even, moving forward from the baby years, when we get to kind of the toddlers and 3s and 4s, we have a lot of conversations in our group about just erratic toddler behavior or impulsive toddler behavior where they're maybe yelling or crying a lot or hitting people. And that
pulling
one,
hair, that was one of ours.
Oh yeah, one of our kids was a hair puller for a while there. He thought it was funny. But I will say, I look back on that and laugh, but when those things are happening, I would say especially, at least speaking for us, with the first child of ours, just because it's your first experience with every age, it feels huge and it feels scary and it's hard to see the way out, right?
We've shed a few tears on the subject, I would say, between us.
Like the hair pulling?
The hair pulling, I think.
Did we shed tears about hair pulling?
One of us might have shed tears about the hair pulling.
It was so long ago, I can't remember.
We may have. Well, we had friends visiting, I remember, and like the concern was, is this person like evil? Like he wants to pull this person's hair.
Like he just won't stop pulling the hair.
And he doesn't feel any remorse about it.
He was like literally 15 months old.
Exactly. But yeah, again, it's always easy to laugh after the problem is no longer there. But if he were going on 9 right now and still pulling hair, we might be pretty concerned.
Well, that would actually be, I think, quite a larger concern. Yes.
For sure. But I think the general idea is that there's going to be these moments. They're going to come up throughout life. And I think we've been working at and getting better at trying to take these moments for what they are, which is typically oftentimes a temporary kind of problem, but actually trying to look at them, these moments as they come up, with a little bit more peace of mind, because sometimes these things will be very short. Sometimes they actually will last a really long time. But the bottom line is that's still the situation you're in, regardless of how long that lasts, right? So trying to gain perspective and move through those times mindfully so that we don't just get bogged down in whatever the biggest problem of the day is, right?
Yeah, and I think there's a piece around a perspective shift here too, where some of the things that we worry about in the moment actually, yes, are problems. Like, I don't really want my kid going around pulling all the other kids' hair, right? There's really nothing about that I could be like, oh, but maybe it's not that big of a deal. But then with some of the other things that feel hard for us, and I think we'll share a story or two in a few minutes, some of those things are actually, I've been able to step back and look at my concern about a certain thing happening with a kid and realize that maybe this actually just isn't such a big deal. Or, maybe he's just going to mature to the point where this thing that I wish he was doing that he's not, he just starts doing. Or maybe he's not doing the thing I wish he was doing because all of these other things are working for him. So I think in some situations, there's a perspective shift of like, my cultural conditioning tells me this is something to worry about, but if I step back and look at it, it's actually just okay.
Yeah, and I think that's where it helps to have a little checklist or a framework to work through to try to figure out how urgent a situation is and how much action needs to be taken.
I like checklists.
Yeah, I know you do, and that's why I was trying to speak your love language of checklists. I
think probably a lot of our listeners might speak my love language too, so.
Well, let's assume they do for the purposes of this podcast. So the first thing I like to try to do is try to identify whether something is developmentally appropriate or not, right? So not everything is going to fall along these like strict developmental lines where the perfect things happen at the perfect times. But for some things, we're talking about big time outliers here, right? So yeah, if your 10-year-old is running around pulling people's hair and laughing about it and showing no remorse, that is a much more significant problem than your 1.5-year-old doing that, right?
Yeah.
So I would say that's the first checklist. And to do that, you'll see these kind of questions pop up everywhere. You can ask in whatever Facebook group you're in, hey, just wondering, like, my kid seems a little old for like X concerning behavior. Does anyone else have experience with this? Not that you need to layer on judgment, but just to give, most of the time you're going to wind up giving yourself peace of mind and saying like, oh, okay, I'm not the only one. Like actually we did a whole episode about when your toddler hits your baby. I feel like that's one that I've seen a number of people get like legitimately concerned.
Because it's understandably very upsetting. Yeah.
Well, you've got this little baby, and like, who could want to hurt this baby, right? Besides a real monster. Like, am I raising the next serial killer because my kid wants to hit the baby? And it's like, no, actually, turns out this is a super common thing that many people just don't talk about because it's so upsetting.
Right.
But then after that, and actually it's kind of related, but it's try to figure out how urgent is this thing really? Like, and the question I would ask myself is, if this behavior doesn't change in the next day, who will suffer? If it doesn't change in the next week, who will suffer? If it doesn't change in the next month and year and so on. And we'll see for some behaviors, like pulling people's hair, okay, that's pretty urgent. Like this is a serious thing. There are people who are being physically harmed and being made to feel scared by this behavior. So I should really like focus some serious energy on it versus something like, say like learning to read, which can feel extremely urgent in the moment. But if we zoom out and take like the timeline question of, well, who is harmed by this in the next week? Nobody. Who's harmed in the next month? Nobody. Who's harmed in the next year? Nobody. I mean, unless your kid's in school, in which case maybe that can start to become concerning. And then you could say, oh, in the next 20 years, yeah, this kid would be potentially worse off if he didn't learn to read. But when you zoom out on that time frame and you realize, okay, I don't need to like panic or get in a fight with my kid about this today because in the next week, no one's going to be harmed. But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would even circle back, because I'm glad that you mentioned the reading example, because I think there's almost like James likes buckets and baskets, so I'm going to talk about it in those terms, but there's almost like two buckets that you could put these things that you might be concerned about in. I think one of them would be like behaviors that our kids are exhibiting that are concerning. And then the other one would be when we're talking about leading a life with your kids where they're a bit more self-directed. The other one might be like they are not doing certain things at a certain age when you think most of their peers are, whether that's reading or writing or having a good sense of numeracy or whatever it is, helping around the house, all of these things. That's not really as much of a behavioral thing, but it's like we have these concerns about them not doing them yet. And so going back to the first point you made, which is this developmentally appropriate? I would kind of put a pin in that when it comes to the things that are more like
skill-based.
Skill-based. Like my kid isn't doing this yet. I'm not sure that I would go and compare what my kid is doing to their peers as much, especially if they are not kind of growing up in like a schooled setting and even if they are in a schooled setting, right? Like some kids are just ready to read a lot sooner than others. Some kids are ready to be more independent with self-care sooner than others. And so I would also check in and really step back and say, like, why do I think my kid should be doing this by X age?
Right.
Should he or she really be doing this by X age? Maybe they're just not, just like walking happens at different ages, maybe they're just not there yet. So I think that, that's kind of what I have to say about that.
I think that's a great perspective. I think, especially when it comes to things that are simply interests, it's very easy to look around and say, oh, by the time I was in 5th grade, every kid I knew learned to swim, let's say. That's been something our kids decided to work on this winter. And it's funny because even though I'm so ingrained in, like, I'm a true believer when it comes to kids being self-directed and pursuing things that they're passionate about. And even though I can logic through it when I'm in this very peaceful state, when I'm not worrying about anything actively, I will get in that mindset about certain skills that I think it's just from my childhood, like the certain skills that felt so important that
when you were a kid,
that I can picture the pain I would have gone through had I not had those skills in the environment I was in. And then I picture my kids doing that, even if it's not consciously. I can kind of feel their pain almost. And it's really, really difficult. Actually, there's a really funny example of that. I can remember my grandma growing up, who's like the fun grandma, the one we always play with, who cared about us so much. I can recall her like breathlessly talking to my mom about me not being able to play volleyball. Okay. And that sounds kind of random, but my grandma was a gym teacher and in high school, she was a high school gym teacher, and she could remember how miserable it was for the kids that didn't know how to play volleyball. They would get picked on and they would feel embarrassed and they would just feel like scared of the ball hitting them in the head and stuff. So she was really serious about me learning how to play volleyball. And I did learn how to play some volleyball, and I was grateful for knowing how to play volleyball when I got to high school and I saw those poor kids with the balls bouncing off their heads and stuff. I know. Volleyball in high school is so fun, by the way, when we actually played it. A side note. But it's funny, though, because that was just her life experience, right? In reality, I never learned how to play volleyball. I just wouldn't have signed up for volleyball class. It would have been fine.
Yeah.
But I just thought I think that's a funny example of how how it's basically, when you see it in someone else, it's so obviously in their own minds. Like, who cares if you can play volleyball or not? But trying to check myself in terms of, well, what's my volleyball?
Like, where is this coming from? What are my beliefs around this? What script is running in my head?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
And where does that come from? Is it just a tough experience I had as a kid growing up? Because when you're a kid, there are tapes that play in your mind too.
Yeah.
Like sometimes that's around, oh, well, this isn't fair, Like a lot of the reading I was doing on internal family systems, the therapy method talks about that, where it's like these certain tapes can play in your mind over and over and over again. And then it can become an entrenched belief that you're not even aware of.
Right.
And so when it comes to skill development especially, there's probably a whole different checklist for that. Do you want to go into skill development, or should we circle back to, like, my kid is exhibiting this concerning behavior? And
yeah, let's go back to that. Let's start with that one.
Okay. So our kid is exhibiting the concerning behavior. Maybe it's one of the scariest ones, like it's hitting other kids on the playground or something. Do you want to talk about, like, in a perfect world, what your first reaction or first plan of action or something like that might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about the hitting one a lot. I don't know if I want to specifically focus on it because...
Well, you can pick a different example if you think there's a better one, but...
Well, let's talk about the one that came up in our group about the kid not playing independently.
Oh, yeah. So, and well, see that... I see that
falls
as a
into
skill.
More of a skill one.
Exactly. So maybe we should just do the skill one.
Let's just do
that,
it. It seems like we're feeling it.
It feels natch.
Yeah.
It's short for natural, if you're not hip with what the kids are saying these days.
I'm pretty sure the kids are not saying that.
They might be.
Okay.
I hang out with the kids more than you do. Like, not our kids. I mean, with my new thing I've been doing at the Self-Directed Learning Center.
Okay.
I'm learning what's hip now.
Okay.
So, moving on. So this is another question from our group. And essentially, there was a mom, and I won't go back and read the whole thing now, but the gist of it was, when we're at the house, or anywhere really, my kid doesn't want to play alone. I see all these other kids. Mm-hmm. They're playing in the sandbox. They're playing a make-believe game with their 2 stuffed animals. And my kid is like walking over to me, putting me to work. Like, what game are we going to play, Mommy?
Yeah.
When are we going to go in the monkey bars? When are you going to play trucks? Give Thomas jobs. That was our version of that when our son Ollie was 2 years old.
Thomas the Tank Engine. I think you need a little more context for that.
Thomas could be like his little brother or something. Thomas the Tank Engine. So talk about that then. I mean... There's a kid, he doesn't play alone. As a parent, that's really draining.
Yeah, I mean, when that post went up in our group, I wanted to like jump through the screen and hug that mom, first of all, because that was so much of my experience with our oldest when he was about the same age as her child is now, especially because she talked about how she also has like a 1-year-old, right? I think this child was 3 or something, and she has a baby or an almost 1-year-old who needs attention too, but she talks about how the baby will kind of do her own thing a little more. And I really just identified with this because our oldest was so much like this. As a small child, always wanted one-on-one interaction constantly. And there were like 2 parts of that for me. It was draining and tiring because as much as I love him and loved him, like I just can't do toddler things all day.
I can only play trains for like maybe 3 hours in a row.
Oh my gosh,
7
that's
hours
so long. Right. And then the other piece was, so it was like the day-to-day of kind of like feeling like I needed to do that. And then the other piece was the worry of like, why can't, like I feel like in my head I'm seeing all these kids be independent, like why can't he entertain himself for a little bit of time? And I think everybody would deal with this in different ways, and definitely different people from different schools of thoughts would have maybe even conflicting ideas or advice. So there's definitely a school of thought of like, we really need to teach our children to play independently, and we need to be conscious about stepping back and giving them space to do that and not interrupting their play when they are doing it. And to a certain degree, I would agree. Like if your kid actually is doing something on their own, challenging yourself to like not jump in and say like, oh, what are you doing? Like actually letting them have that space, because that's how they start to develop those skills, is great. And I will say that for me, that school of thought made me really, really anxious because it made me feel like I was failing when my kid almost never played by himself. Right. And so I kind of said to this mom in our group, like just from my own experience, for me, it was a process of coming to just accept that my kid just really, really liked one-on-one interaction. And once I stopped worrying so much about like what this meant for him as an older person, and like once I kind of got all of those fears in check, I was able to be much more at peace with just this is who he is and the way that he is. And we did talk about, there was some good conversation on that thread about, is there somebody who could come to your house for like a couple hours a week and play with him so that you can get that break? And I mean, I might have even said there's no need to feel guilty if there's like a show he likes to watch for a little while, or definitely. What are things that you can offer to him that are enjoyable for both of you, right? Like all of these ways that we can still take care of ourselves so we don't feel responsible for constantly entertaining our children. I'm definitely not saying we should do that. But, and I also talked about how one of my ways was inviting him to do things with me that I was doing. So like inviting him to help me cook and help me do the dishes and help me with the laundry, and kind of making those tasks fun and engaging, and that seemed to work really well too with him. And
he still likes to do some of that stuff now with you, like do the cooking and stuff.
Yeah,
like
exactly. So I think that for me and where I'm coming from, it was more of a perspective shift again, of like, there's not actually really anything wrong with him being this way. He's happy, right? He's not insecure. He's enjoying his life and he's fine. He just really, really likes one-on-one interaction. And so how can I help him have that while also not burning myself out? And how can I find ways for him to be engaged when I can't or don't want to be giving him that 8 hours in a row, like when I was home and you were at work?
Sure. Well, so I think the big thing, and you touched on this before we started recording today, is loving the kid you have in the moment, right? Not the kid that you wish you had. Because and
not as much loving, because of course you love them, but like accepting, right?
Yeah. Well, and right. I'm not talking about like, do I love this kid or not, but like really enjoying the kid you have, accepting him, but going even beyond. Like, acceptance to me sounds like, yeah, I'll accept this kid. But even trying to move yourself into a mindset of like, appreciating those qualities about the kid. And maybe that's unrealistic at first if it's something that's kind of a hot button issue. And then also, I think, understanding that trying to be more mindful and present in the exact moment that you're in is, I think, a really killer hack for this situation, because part of, and I'll say you, because I'm talking to you, but this happens to me too.
You're talking to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Part of you sometimes will be like, okay, this is stressful in the moment, and today is hard because I just don't want to draw pictures anymore. That was another thing you got into.
Oh, yeah. We would have to draw for hours, but it was him telling me what to draw.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a funny one too. So part of you is like, okay, I don't want to sit and draw pictures, or I don't want to play trains or whatever. But then what compounds it really exponentially is this worry that it's going to be a problem forever.
Exactly.
Right? So it's not only accepting the kid you have at the moment you have them, but also not worrying for the kid you might have someday before you know that that's actually the problem, because you're going to have plenty of problems in the future anyway.
Yeah.
So worrying and trying to guess what they're going to be is rarely a very fruitful enterprise. And so, yeah, your kid is right in front of you right now. He's got his own issues right now. She's got her own things she's working on right now. Focus on that, because that's plenty. That's enough to fill your plate. And you're going to wind up overfilling your plate and overwhelming yourself when you try to play Nostradamus and try to figure out what problems are going to be there in the future because of what's there now. Now, it's not to say you want to ignore the long term forever. Like, you don't want, I don't know, your 8-year-old smoking cigarettes or something because there's no problem with it today. But I still think you just, if you start by focusing on the things that are in front of you in that moment, in that day, that will let you know, that will always alert you to the most urgent things that you ought to be thinking about.
Yeah. It's like I feel like it's like a 2-pronged approach of, like you're saying, kind of seeing and honoring the kid you have right now, regardless of whatever they're dealing with or whatever you're dealing with as a result of kind of what they're going through. And then also strategizing around how you can take care of yourself if this thing is feeling hard, so that you can stay present and in the moment with them when you are with them. And like in this example, how you can feed their love of one-on-one in additional ways besides just you, right? Or other ways you can give that to them than playing the things they love most. So it's like kind of balancing those two things, I think. But there's so much freedom in kind of letting go of that fear and just, seeing and honoring the kid who is right in front of you. Because again, I think this is one of those things when we talk about, it's like the introversion and extroversion thing. It's like we are kind of told that it's better for, let's say, a 3-year-old to be independent and to be playing independently, when how could every person in the world possibly be the same, right? Like, some kids are just going to like one-on-one attention more. And when you really peel back the layers, like maybe there's just, yes, I'm still like holding space for that being hard for the parent, but as far as worrying about our kid, like maybe there's just nothing wrong with that. And maybe we can strategize around how to take care of ourselves through it if it's hard for us, but realize that our kid is actually in this situation just okay. Like,
yeah, and in those troubling moments, like, I like to think about evolution sometimes, and I'm just like, organisms tend to evolve differently, because that's actually advantageous for the whole species.
Yeah, totally.
Right? It's why species of things where everything is totally identical, they're very at risk to not being able to adapt. They have all these different issues. They can get, cellular issues and genetic diseases and all that stuff, right? And so diversity and kids being different from one another is great and beneficial for everybody in the world, and not just our own kids and our own family. And obviously, again, if we go back to the framework of, is this behavior harming others? Well, okay. Hey, my kid is just different. He punches people in the face. That's obviously not going to fly. But if we're talking strictly in terms of, and this just seems like the direction this episode's heading, strictly in terms of my kid is a little bit different than I expected, or has different interests than I expected, or isn't interested in these things that I think everyone should be on some surface level interested in, understanding that diversity is okay. And we celebrate diversity in so many ways. The smallest minority is the individual, I guess, is the observation I would make. And so this person, this unique person before us, I think, like, one of the things that helps me for my self-care is believing and really understanding that my first job is to preserve this person's individuality, not to try to jam them in and to get them to conform and have the same boring hobbies that everyone has, it's like, or the same boring interests that every single person must have. And I guess another just peace of mind thing is that sometimes, especially when it comes to interests, sometimes that will change over time and sometimes it won't. And so I like to remind myself of that so that I have a plan to show my kid love and affection and positive attention regardless. Because maybe they're just going to be into, like in your case, actually, I think this is a good example too. Like, our kids are still into playing video games, 4 or 5 years later after they first tried, right? So you could have spent the last 5 years resenting that and waiting for them to want to come knit with you. Or you could have spent that time engaging them and warming up to it. And even if it takes a little longer because it's not naturally your biggest interest in the world. We just went to this gaming convention this last weekend, PAX East in Boston, where there's 10,000 gamers. And you're raising your eyebrows so people at home can't see. But 10,000 gamers gaming, talking about games. And you probably didn't picture yourself there when we've had our first son and you're holding him in your arms there. But it meant so much to them to be able to communicate to you about their interests and do all that stuff. So if you had kept waiting for them to change, and they might change, actually, their interests seem to be moving away from video games more recently, incidentally. But if you had sat around waiting for them to change, that would have been 5 years of missed opportunities, right?
Totally. So we have a couple other stories, I think, that we were going to share that kind of, I think, help illuminate what we're talking about today. Let's share the one other from the group before we share a couple of our own.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so our friend Becky in our Facebook group shared, she gave me permission to share her name, by the way. She just shared this awesome reflection just this past week in our group, and I thought it was a great example. When we actually started talking about this episode, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a perfect story. So one thing that she has talked about in the past being worried about is her oldest child's, I think he's 5 now, his kind of resistance to engaging in like self-care on his own. So kind of getting himself dressed and all things around that. So that's been something that's been concerning her and that like she's kind of wished he would kind of catch up on. And she posted the other day that so her daughter who's 3 or 4 gets her own milk. So she talked about this process that her daughter goes through to like get the stool, go to the fridge, get the milk, move the stool, pour it. Like, it's no small feat for a child that small to pour a big thing of milk. Yeah. So she talked about that. And then she talked about how that morning she came downstairs and her son, who is pretty, like I said, hesitant to kind of engage in these things on his own, was cutting his own nails. And how her husband said he had just gone and grabbed the clippers and was clipping them, and how he kind of mentioned that he had like cut himself just a little bit, but he was fine and he was doing great. And she was like, I was just so blown away to see him just kind of like do this thing on his own. No one challenged him to do it. No one asked him, suggested he should. And then she had a really cool reflection on the end about like, so when I'm sitting around worrying about them not wanting to like color inside the lines of the paper or practice writing their names or whatever, they're challenging themselves to do these other pretty big tasks for kids their age. So for me, there were like 2 things in that. One of them was this thing that her son wasn't engaging in. He's starting to do it, right? It's like we talked about, a lot of these things just come in time, and they maybe don't come as soon as we expected they would. So that was a really cool reflection that he just kind of jumped in and did this thing by himself. And then I think the other piece was, at least the way that I interpreted it was, we have all of these things we worry that our kids aren't doing, and it's so powerful to stop and notice what they are doing. So yeah, that's what I want to say. I lost my train of thought there.
No, I think that's really good, actually. I think recognizing that, 2 things. The first is that you could sit there, and I've seen this, and I've actually had this feeling arise in myself, and I had to check it, which is, oh, this kid's finally doing this thing, right? So you can kind of almost like grudgingly accept and / like seem a little bit resentful of it. Like, oh, it's about time. Somebody's finally brushing his own teeth, you know? Or you can take joy in it and be like, whoa, all of a sudden this kid's brushing his own teeth.
I loved how her
sense of wonder about
was so celebratory.
It was great. And I think once you have that piece, most of life's moments when it comes to interacting with kids just get so much more joy built into it because you're not constantly sitting there waiting for the next check mark on your checklist to get checked off. You get delighted when, because oftentimes if you can make space for it, you don't even know which thing on the list or whatever they're going to check off. You don't know which things they're going to add to the list that you never could have imagined, right? You know, the precocious 5-year-old that all of a sudden knows all the different species of bees, or you know, like kids will just surprise you if they have the space to surprise you,
and if it feels safe. Yeah, exactly.
And if they feel like you're going to be interested in the thing that you surprise them with, rather than, well, why'd you spend so much time learning about this video game you're into instead of learning your ABCs, or so probably the kid knows its ABCs by then. And so there's that piece, and then there's the other piece, and this is a powerful tool I think we use actually pretty frequently, which is whenever we're faced with one of these situations, I will literally just draw up a whole laundry list of things we were once concerned about that we're just no longer concerned about. So frankly, if your kid is almost any age, except for like newborn, there's probably something you were worried about
that now has resolved itself.
Like, how many people are like really felt like their kid was potty trained the moment they would want them to be, right? There was probably some amount of worry. And how many kids never get potty trained? Almost none, right? How many kids hit other kids on the playground or yell at their parents, or, you know, the list goes on and on and on. And you have this list, if you can make space to look for it, of all these things your kid has accomplished that at one point you were nervous about.
Yeah, and that is a really helpful tool. Like when I get kind of go in a hole about these things, you do that for me too. You're like, look at all of these things that we were worried about that have worked themselves out.
Right. Well, and I think actually the catalyst for things working out too is when we cannot layer on, because I talked about how the worry will make it more difficult for us. I think it also makes it more difficult for them.
Oh, totally.
Especially if your kid is very headstrong and stubborn, like the way I was as a kid, where input or pressure, and we have one kid especially like this in our family too, pressure from the outside actually just makes it like so the person doesn't want to do it at all. Right?
Yeah.
Can I share a funny story? Because this is another one where, because I can talk a big game about, hey, just have some peace of mind. Remember back to all these things your kids have checked off, and they'll figure it out eventually if they're meant to. So we had an amazing winter with skiing. Skiing was a huge thing in our family, and our kids made incredible progress in skiing, and it was so much fun. And ski season's coming to a close, even here in New Hampshire. And as it was coming to a close, I was putting some skis away, and I noticed the bikes that we had in our shed.
In the shed?
And I was like, oh, the bikes. Because our kids did not know how to ride bikes when I saw them in the shed.
Like last week.
Yeah, and I was like, oh man, and I'm going right back to, I had so much fun riding a bike as a kid, and like, it's kind of weird. Like, they know how to ski, like one kid skied double black diamonds this winter, and he can't ride a bike, and I'm just like...
And this isn't for lack of exposing them or trying to help them learn. No. They've just been kind of...
Just no interest in riding bikes, right? And so we're like... So anyway, I go into this space, and I'm like, all this great advice I have about thinking about the successes, blah, 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 totally out the window. I'm totally concerned about it and annoyed, and I know as it gets nicer weather, I'm going to see all those other kids riding their bikes, and I'm going to wish that my kids could ride bikes, because I would think that, and it's not mean-spirited, it's just because I think they would find joy in it. And so, anyways, I go about my days for a couple of days, and then I show up at this co-op that we go to, where a lot of homeschooled kids just go and play, basically, and can learn some stuff, and I show up, and...
You met us there.
I met you there, and you had brought the bikes, and I show up, and our oldest son wheels his bike over, and is like, hey, Dad, I want to learn how to ride a bike now. And I was like, okay. And like, and our other son says the same thing. Me too. I want to learn how to ride a bike, because we see all the other kids riding bikes. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I have our 3-year-old here. There's like cars around. Like, I'm going to be trying to hold one while like, and I'm also picturing like what I did when I tried to help the one guy learn to ride a bike before, where I'm like hunching over and hurting my back, and like he's yelling because he's fallen over, and I'm like, oh boy, I'm excited that they're interested in learning, but this is like going to be hard. And so I'm like trying to steel myself and trying to be positive, because it's just what I was hoping for. And then he says, actually, let me just see if I can remember anything from last time or something like that. And then he gets on and he starts riding around the parking lot, and I'm at this point completely freaked out. Like I haven't been this like just weirded out and having like icky feelings almost. Like, How is he just able to do this? He stands up on the pedals and he's like riding around. And then our other son.
So the one you were just talking about is almost 9.
Yeah. And he, to be fair, had a little bit of experience kind of riding without training wheels. And then our other son says, oh, me too. I want to try. And he gets on. And I've never seen him put his butt on a bike without training wheels on, besides like a Strider bike. And then he starts riding around
and
too.
He's almost 7.
And I'm like, whoa. And I don't even have words. And I can't even calculate in my mind how this could have happened.
Right.
Because like the snow has just melted. We still have snow in our driveway. I'm like, they weren't like secretly practicing all winter. But it turned out that when I had gone out for the morning, you had just busted the bikes out with them.
Yeah.
And they just knew how to ride, kind of. Or they took them like 20 minutes to figure it out.
Well, basically, yeah, that morning while you were out, I busted out the bikes, and our older one, just the minute he sat on it, I could tell. And I just said to him, I was like, you're going to ride. I can tell that you can just ride it. Like, your body's just going to know what to do. And he was just off riding. And then the middle one, who's almost 7, we probably spent like an hour, and he was really frustrated at first because he could get going for a second and then he would fall and he'd get frustrated with himself. But by the time we showed up to meet you, he was pretty much doing it.
Yeah. And for me, I was just like, well, first of all, again, when I got over my complete and utter surprise, because it was like the most, like they actually couldn't ride when I had left at 9 a.m. and I come see you guys at 2 p.m. and they were riding bikes. So besides the complete and utter surprise, it was just such a great reminder of like, oh, duh, this is why we don't worry about things, because there was just this moment in March where they decided it was interesting, and all these other skills and just living their life in general had led them to this moment where they probably knew that if they tried to do something, they could figure it out. And all that worry that I invested was just such a wasted investment.
Right.
Like, all that time I had spent feeling anxious, and if I'm being honest with myself, a couple years ago, trying to pressure them to figure it out, because I was worried, because again, all the kids in my neighborhood could ride bikes, and the ones that couldn't do it very well got picked on and stuff like that. What a waste. And I could have just not bothered with all that stuff, and they would still be riding bikes just as well today.
Right.
And I don't know. So not only the power of when a kid's ready to do something, they can probably just figure it out, but also just a reminder to myself to try and just take a deep breath sometimes, because, and it's amazing that after this winter in particular, that I hadn't already learned that, because I mean, I feel like there were 10 things this winter that reminded us of that. It was
just like a crazy winter of growth, especially for our middle child, as far as just like learning new skills and trying new things. And
well, yeah, they learned to swim. They weren't swimming at the beginning of the winter, again, even though they were older than you and I were when we learned to swim.
Yeah.
And now they're like totally competent to even swim in deep water. Our middle son learned to read, and he learned to read a year before his older brother, again, with no instruction.
Or before the age that his older brother was when he learned,
No instruction, no pressure, just figured it out. He's still not totally fluent in it, but he's like, can mostly get by, which is, again, startling considering that he's never had a single lesson on how to read. They both randomly just started wanting to write and found that with, I'm going to say, actual zero practice, like never picking up a pen.
I mean, they've picked up pens a few times in their life.
I know that, but I mean, what I was going to say was in a year.
Yeah.
Right? That's going to sound scary to a lot of
people. I know people are going to listen to this like, what is going on?
Whatever, dude. They type. They know how to communicate. They're great speakers. But they picked up these pens, but actually their handwriting had dramatically improved in a year without picking up a pen.
Yeah.
And sorry for weird. We get it. Just try to suspend your disbelief that this is our crazy life. But again, they wrote their names. They wrote birthday cards for grandma. Totally legible. Totally like appropriate to skill level and all that stuff.
And that was a big one for me because, and I probably, if I'm being honest, still harbor a little bit of fear on the like picking up a pen and writing, because it's still not something either of them love. And I do wonder, when are they going to when is that really going to click for them? But I've also seeing them sit down and try it a bit this winter has done like what the bike thing did for you. It's been like, oh, you could waste all this time worrying, or you could just continue to make the tools available, they see me pick up a pen and make lists and write. You'll continue to model it and be ready to support them when they want to try. And these things are going to happen.
Yeah. And again, if you're just like, for me, it's been setting aside that subconscious linear pathway that I believe, whether I want to or not, is like the right way for kids to learn, or the right timeline. and recognize that just because our kids' timeline looks like learning how to get really good at skiing and then writing and then swimming and then riding a bike and then, whatever. And for them, it was actually doing the math thing was like they were way early on that piece, right? But their journey, their educational journey, it zigzags dramatically compared to the way a journey would look if they had gone through the traditional educational paradigm thus far, right? And not only that, if like all of these skills were plotted along a graph where like it's time versus improvement, a lot of times you would see like a year plateau of a skill.
And then like a huge leap.
Exactly. Yeah. And instead of like the steady line that I think people imagine when they think about kids learning these skills, and it's kind of forced on them, frankly, it looks like huge spikes and then plateaus. Huge spike and then maybe a slight decline because they just don't do something for a while. And then another little spike here and, maybe a gradual increase in the thing that they do every day or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's just very irregular, but also kind of beautiful in the same way wildflowers are beautiful, right? It's like no one had to plan it out, but at the end it just makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
And I don't know. So we're actually running pretty close up against time.
Yeah, I hope that just hearing these different stories is helpful, from the members of our group and from our own experience. I think stories are powerful and just kind of making a point, right? And I think we just really want to share that with everything, like we've said, everything that seems hard or everything that we're concerned about. Like you said, James, if you're anybody who has anything older than a newborn, you've seen that many of these things resolve and kind of change over time. And so being able to stay present with them and strategize around how we can make life fulfilling for us even in those moments, I think is really powerful.
Totally. And I'll go back as well to my belief that I think we've evolved to treat every problem that arises in our life with almost the same amount of seriousness, maybe not perfectly, but reminding ourselves that at any given moment in life, there's something that we could focus on as the biggest problem right now. And if we can be better about recognizing which of those are actually the big serious problems that require that like urgent, this needs my attention now sort of energy, and then recognize which of those things we can kind of take a step back on, that will actually preserve our energy levels. It will preserve our ability to handle things intentionally for when it really matters.
I think that's so true because each of us has a finite amount of emotional energy, and I have to say that just rings so true for me as the years have gone by as a parent. I've been able to, I think you can vouch for this, let go of more and more worry. And everything has gotten better. Like my own emotional well-being has gotten better. My relationship with my kids is astronomically better when I've been able to let go of things that I've recognized probably don't deserve my energy. And I have all of this energy freed up to be present and joyful with my kids. And there are bigger things that come up that definitely do require my attention, but maybe I feel like I have more energy to give those things now. Yeah,
you've really reinvested that energy for a very positive return. Not stick with too many investment analogies here, but I think it's been a huge difference maker. And I think especially, I think the last thing I would want to leave with is when you are in that position where you're worrying and you feel like you're putting out fires every day, it's very easy. This actually happened with me in professional pursuits as well. It's very easy to believe that that's what is keeping everything okay. It's that you worrying, you investing that energy. And if you weren't doing that, then it wouldn't be okay. And it was actually our dog, Reggie, who taught me that can sometimes not be the greatest way to think about it, because every day he'll look out the window and he'll bark at the mailman and tell the mailman to go away, right? Every day the mailman goes away, but poor Reggie doesn't know that he doesn't need to bark to make the mailman go away.
He thinks his barking did the trick, right? The mailman didn't come in and attack us all.
Exactly. So every day he doubles down and he's ready and waiting and wants to bark and tell that mailman to get lost. And if he could just take a week off, he would see that the mailman wouldn't break in, and then he could see that he could stop barking.
Right.
And he could save his energy for the actual, he's got a pretty good life.
For the actual intruder that might come into our house someday.
Exactly. And I think in our own lives, like trying to figure out when we're barking at the mailman versus when we're actually dealing with the intruders is one of those things that can really just pay extreme dividends in the long term. So.
Boom.
What an analogy to end the podcast with.
Look at that.
Let's just soak that in for a second. And then we'll call it a day. Do you remember the outro?
I do. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. And remember that each moment is a new opportunity to be the parent that you hope to be.
Yeah, and as I remember, I like to say, I love you guys. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to One Free Family. If you enjoy the podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron at onefreefamily.com/support. Your support will help make this show better. Plus, you can get access to rewards and additional episodes by joining. Again, that's onefreefamily.com/support. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.